The U.S. education system has many critics who see a continuing deterioration in our schools. Thomas Sowell, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, is one of those. As the older generation of teachers and professors leave, he says, new trends and counterproductive fads, fashions, and dogmas of American education will become the dominant influence and shape the generations to come. In short, he argues, American schools are turning out students who are not intellectually incompetent, but also morally confused, emotionally alienated, and socially maladjusted. The problem is not merely that Johnny can't read or even that Johnny can't think. Johnny doesn't know what thinking is, says Dr. Sowell, because thinking is so often confused with feeling in many public schools.
Back in 1966, there were about twice as many C's as A's given out in the public schools in the United States. By the late 70s, there were twice as many A's as C's. So you have this long period during which all sorts of test scores are going down. At this very same time, grades are going up.
Is that going on at both the elementary, secondary level, and college level?
At the college level. During the entire decade of the 1980s, the percentage of A's at Yale University never fell below 40%.
So you're saying there's a great inflation going on, and there are declining test scores.
Yes. And this is part of the deception, because if people knew exactly what was happening, I don't think the test scores could have kept going down as long as they did. But everyone was told, they saw the wonderful grades their kids were bringing home. They were told glowing things. When I was teaching back in the 1960s, I kept hearing that this was the brightest and best generation that we'd had, and I kept saying, they don't seem to be enrolling in my courses. And it was only well into the 70s before the word came out that the data showed just the opposite of what the educators were saying.
And now it would seem that a good many educators are in agreement with you when they talk about the serious straits that our American schools are in.
They agree in the sense only that this kind of talk gets them more money. And in fact, that's used as the biggest reason why we need more money. But in point of fact, the money spent on education was rising by leaps and bounds throughout the entire period during which the test scores were going down. Somewhere in the early 80s, there was a leveling off and a few little rises, but we have never come close to where we were in 1963.
Talk about the social phenomenon you call affective education and how it plays into this whole question of just how good schools are.
A great deal of time and energy are spent on things which are non-academic subjects, which are essentially psychological kinds of subjects, exercises. And this is known as affective education, as if you can somehow educate people's feelings rather than to educate their intellect. And the problem is that most public school teachers have no such qualifications, if anyone has such qualifications. But certainly they are not psychiatrists or psychologists. They have no idea of the emotional turmoil they may be stirring up in the students. And there's some evidence that that's happening in terms of medical reactions, of vomiting, signs of nerves in various ways. But more than that, what they tend to do is to try to alienate the child from the parent. And I think that's the most dangerous thing they do.
How did they do that?
Well, if you read the literature, it's just astonishing how parents are depicted in the literature as people who are hung up, who have old-fashioned ideas. One of the areas in which they do this is sex education, but it's not sex education as such, because there are a whole series of kinds of education of the emotions, as they would put it. Which do the same thing. And the idea is that the child is supposed to make his own decisions, and he's supposed to pick his own values on which to make those decisions. So the whole history of the human race is sort of thrown out the window, and Johnny is supposed to start and draw upon his entire 8 or 9 years of experience in the world to decide what his values ought to be.
Dr. Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution. His new book is called Inside American Education, The Decline, the Deception, the Dogmas. Talk about some of the dogmas that you feel are driving American education.
Well, one of the dogmas is the notion that you have to feel good about yourself. And I think nothing so epitomizes this for me as a study of mathematics given to 13-year-olds around the world. And Koreans came in first, Americans came in last. And one of the questions that were asked these kids was, are you good at math? 23% of the Koreans said yes. Something like 68% of the Americans said yes. And so American kids felt good about themselves, but they didn't know any math. Another study was done of 12th graders in Japan to see if they liked math. The 12th graders in Japan disliked math more than the 12th graders in the United States, and probably for good reason, because it was probably hard at math. But the Japanese don't worry themselves about whether their 12th graders like math. They worry
or
themselves.
feel good about
That's
themselves.
right. They don't care. The fact is, when you come out of there, you're going to know a certain amount of stuff. And if you don't do that, your parents are going to be on you.
Is there a balance to be achieved? That is, helping students feel good about themselves and learn at the same time? Or is it either or, Dr. Sowell?
I do not believe that there are free lunches in education or anywhere else.
And it's hard work.
That's right. And I think that's part of it, too. A lot of these programs are really a substitute for hard work by the teachers. I mean, when I think of the teachers I had, they could not have cared less whether I felt good about myself. They didn't ask me, how did you get to school? Did you walk these 15 blocks from home? Or did you have money for the trolley? They couldn't have cared less. They wanted to make sure I had better have my homework when I got there, and it had better be right.
Are you putting most of the responsibility here on the teachers themselves? What about the parents?
The parents have their responsibilities as well. On the whole, the parents, I think, turn out a lot better than the education establishment. The education establishment is very good at blaming everything on parents and seizing upon this example and that example. But the cold fact is that for a period of decades, the parents and the public have been pushing the schools to have more academic material, and the schools have been pushing in non-academic directions. And by and large, the schools have been winning, that more and more fancy fads and gimmicks have been coming into the schools. Very often people say, the Catholic schools do so much better with so little money. And I've come to think that really I don't want to take anything from the Catholic schools. But I think the fact that they have less money may be one of the reasons why they're doing so well, because they cannot afford these expensive gimmicks and fads. The social tragedy of it is especially hard on low-income people. You see, if you're low income, you're either going to get a good education or you're going to stay in poverty, by and large, with rare exceptions. People of my generation in Harlem got a good education. And so no matter how poor they were, they could always go on. People very often try to be complimentary to me and say, how wonderful it is that you came out of this background and went on to get your degrees and all this kind of business. And I try to tell them, that was not that unusual. That half a block away from me, there was a guy who went on to become a psychiatrist, owned land in Napa Valley, and is now living in retirement overseas while I'm out here trying to work for a living. In the same building that he lived in lived Harry Belafonte. 5 blocks the other way was James Baldwin, you see. 3 blocks this way was where Colin Powell went to college at CCNY. And these are all people at the same place at the same time. And you notice that all of those people, although how different they are, they all spoke impeccable English. There was none of this junk that you hear now that's being lionized as so-called black English, which the kids' parents don't speak. That you got a good education. Now, what you did with it was your business.
What would be the first 1 or 2 steps you would take to put American education back on track and to reach those young people who are now as turned off as they can possibly be?
Number 1, I would have parental choice, whether you call it a voucher, tax credit, don't care what name it is or what kind of device, but some way in which parents can decide to yank their kids out of that school if it's not doing the job. Because as long as the school has a captive audience and ironclad tenure, they're going to do what they want to do, no matter what the public wants, no matter what the parents want, no matter what the taxpayers want, and no matter what the employers want. The great problem in education throughout is that people are not accountable. They can run those schools to indulge themselves, whether for whatever fad they like, for whatever way they like to teach, and that goes all the way through to the colleges. The professors are there to do their research, and if the students don't get in the way, they don't mind. But those schools are not being run as places for teaching.
All right, so in addition to school choice, what else?
Elimination of tenure at all levels. Well, that may not be universally popular, but they've done it in England, so it can be done. As long as people are rewarded just for being alive and sitting there for a certain number of years, regardless of the quality of work that they do, you cannot expect good quality work.
What about the financial factor, Dr. Sowell? You talked about it earlier and said that, everybody keeps blaming the fact that the schools aren't doing well on lack of resources, and it's not just money that's the problem.
Not only is it not just money, I would even argue that the country has been generous to a fault. You look at other countries around the world, that includes Japan, Australia. The average American kid gets twice as much money spent on him as the average kid in New Zealand. Kids in New Zealand are doing a lot better. They're getting a lot more spent on them than was spent on the kids in my era. And they're doing much worse than the kids in my era. I mean, I had to send my daughter to a private school to get an education almost as good as I got in the public school for nothing. So we have fallen very far behind.
Carlene, you're on the air.
My question has to do with a friend who recently went back to George Mason University. She wants to be a teacher in the public high schools. And being interested, I looked at some of her class notes and a book that she's using, and it has to do with the methodology of teaching in the public schools. And it's something like a blueprint for multi-diversity cultural education or something. And the book is teaching teachers how to teach, but the whole thing the book is about is how America's made up of all these different groups and how teachers have to be sensitive to all these different groups, and it had all these songs like from Amish people and
okay.
Excuse me, but I started thinking to myself, well, this methodology obviously is reflecting what the demographic changes in America, and also reflecting the culture war in America. And I see personally that America is starting to become a kind of social Lebanon, where all these different groups are trying to get sort of a piece of the action. And I thought to myself, and I said to my friend, I tried to talk to her about this, and her biggest worry about her next exam was if she was going to have to memorize the national holidays of 15 different countries so that she can be sensitive to her students. And I'm thinking, Dr. Sowell, what does this have to do with education? Is the school supposed to be an agent of socialization in America, or is it, I just don't understand.
Sure.
That kind of
Interesting point, Carlene. Go ahead, Dr. Sowell.
Tragically, this is the view of the education establishment, that is what the school is supposed to be doing. What's so ironic is the school is failing so miserably in what they are paid to do that they should take on this role of being social philosophers. And when you think of the pitiful academic background of the people who are taking on this kind of job, you also wonder what can be going through their minds at all. It's not true that we're becoming a multicultural nation for the first time. This country had people who were speaking umpteen different languages, probably to a greater degree 70 or 80 years ago than today. Because you had vast numbers of people. I know people today who are professors and whatnot who say, we never spoke English in my home, but they went on anyway. And they became bilingual, not because they were bilingual programs, but because their parents spoke one thing at the home and they spoke something else at the schools.
But as well as I do, you can't turn the clock back. We seem to have moved to a different place in the society in terms of its expectations, in terms of what it will tolerate and not tolerate. There is a push towards recognition of all of these various groups that make up our society. So what do? You can't say.
I'm sorry, I can't agree with any of that. It is not society that is forcing these people to do this. These people have been looking for ways of evading academic work for generations.
Who is they? When you say
the teachers, the administrators, they love anything that is non-academic. There have been studies done of kids in schools and departments of education. They love anything that's non-academic when you get into role playing and all this kind of thing. And I think it's perfectly understandable. You get the dregs of the academic world becoming teachers. You have education courses that repel able students from ever studying the subject. And so you've cut them off at the pass. Anyone who has any ability does not want to take these ridiculous courses in college. And of the few who are hardy souls who go on and take it and suffer through them and become teachers, those with high ability are the first ones to drop out. And so within a very few years out of the class, you have the bottom half of the class now has tenure and the top half is going somewhere else.